Now, the impacts are varied, but here's 3 for you that can take to the bank straight away. And the first is desensitization. The brain may become less responsive to familiar stimulus, leading to reduced emotional engagement because we actually don't respond as well to something that is familiar. And there are so many ways that that plays out in all of our lives. And when that happens, when the brain becomes less responsive to what you were saying, it will dramatically reduce the ability of your audience to remember anything about you because they're switched off. Hey there, and welcome back to the next conversation in the Speaker Driven Business Podcast. And this week, I am going to get straight into it. There is something that I want you to stop doing. And this is what it is. I want you to stop overusing stories and metaphors and quotes. These are the stories and the quotes and the metaphors that we hear over and over and over again. And there's a very important reason why we shouldn't use them. I'm going to sum it up in just one sentence that I will then unpack in the rest of this episode. And that one sentence is this: the moment that you use a story or a metaphor or a quote that is overused, you kill engagement. Let me say that again. The minute you use stories, metaphors, or quotes that are overused, you kill engagement. Now, there's a whole heap of reasons that that happens I'm going to unpack for you. But what I want you to also start with is this. Just because something is new to you does not mean it is new to everybody else. The amount of times I see people open with a story that is so overused, the amount of times that I see people open with a metaphor that is so overused, the amount of times I see people unpack the stories of someone who is prolific or famous, and they're using exactly the same example and elements of that story as everybody else. The amount of times that this happens is literally insane and is driving me crazy. Now, this is not a new phenomenon. I keep thinking that it's going to reduce, but unfortunately, it's not. And so here we are again. I'm going to be discussing it. And when I say it's not new, my very first, probably wasn't my first client, but in my first 3 to 4 clients, 8.5 years ago when I first started doing this work, was a woman by the name of Julie. And she had just exited corporate and had landed her first main stage keynote gig more because of her position that she exited from corporate than anything else. But she was determined. She was going to speak about teams and about leadership. And she was determined to tell the story about Walt Disney. And the one I'm speaking about, I know you're all going to potentially switch off right now because of what I'm about to share with you, but I'm asking you to stay with me. So Julie wanted to speak about the story that we all know about Walt Disney, about being knocked back by, I think it's 37 banks, and I may have the detail wrong, but I don't care because I've heard the story so many times that I actually don't remember the detail. There's a hint for you. But she wanted to tell the story about Walt Disney and being knocked back by banks X amount of times before he finally got the funding and the theme park Disneyland was able to open. The challenge is, the first thing is that it's an overused story. So most people in an entrepreneurial, leadership, corporate organization will have heard that story at some point. And this is almost 10 years ago. And at that time, for the decade before, the story had been told over and over and over again. The other thing is that this woman was going to be talking about teams and leadership. And that story is actually about resilience and tenacity, and some people might say insanity. So not only was the story overused, the story was actually a complete mismatch to the meaning of her promise. And so this is what I challenged her to do in our session. Because she was determined to tell a story about Walt Disney, I challenged her to go away overnight before our next session and find a story that would surprise and delight, something that nobody knew. And the story she came back with was exquisite, and it was totally fit for purpose for the topic of her keynote and the promise made to the audience. And it was this incredible story about exactly what Walt Disney had to do to step into the front and to lead through absolute resistance and doubt to put together, I think it was The Sorcerer's Apprentice. It was the first of his animated movies. She found the story of the tipping point of how he stepped into leadership and led this team through this 72-hour sojourn almost to get this thing moving. And that was the story of leadership. Not only was it now fit for purpose and a match for meaning, that story was also something that was of surprise and delight. It was unexpected. It wasn't being told anywhere, everywhere, and it wasn't everywhere all over the internet. Working in a workshop environment in that first year to 18 months, I think as well, we used to run 3-day intensives for you to structure your signature speech. And one of the women in that room, she was determined to tell the story of Oprah. It was her most inspiring story. The story of Oprah was what got her through everything, and she desperately wanted to share with the audience. She insisted she would be telling it. I insisted she would not. The outcome was at the end of day 2, I told her to go and find a totally different way to tell it. If she was going to insist on telling the story of Oprah, she had to insist on telling, I had to insist that she tell it a totally different way. And I shared with her some ideas on how that might be possible and some starting points. She came back in day 3 with a knockout way of telling the story that actually wove Oprah's timeline in with her own, who was a 27-year-old white girl in Australia. And the power in the revelation of the main character's opera was extraordinary. Same story, told in a completely different way. And in my own work, in my most in-demand keynote throughout my career, which was The Resilience Lie, I opened with a story about Thomas Edison. But it wasn't about 1,000 light bulbs or whatever it is. It wasn't about any of those stories. It was actually a story that I found told by his son Charles the night that Thomas's factory burnt to the ground. Now, there's a certain way that I unfold that story, but it's based on the narrative relayed by his son observing his father as the events of that night unfolded. It surprised and delighted and intrigued and got people's attention. But there are so many overused stories, not just these ones, overused stories and metaphors and quotes. And here is the risk. No matter how much you love it, you will come off sounding cliched. There's the starfish story. This narrative tells of someone walking a beach and throwing a stranded starfish back into the ocean. And the purpose of that story is to demonstrate that even small actions can make a significant difference to each creature's say. It's simple and powerful, but it's led to extensive use in motivational context. And realistically, it is so overused. In fact, if you are in the professional speaking arena, an aspiring or emerging speaker brings that story to the stage, you literally eye roll, and I've seen some people completely disconnect, literally writing a grocery list out beside me. Then there's the quote, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." And yes, that's a great line from a fantastic song, but this particular quote is attributed to philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, and the phrase suggests that adversity contributes to personal growth. It's catchy wording, because it is catchy, has made it a staple in discussions about resilience, but it is so overused. In fact, most people now, when they hear that in any kind of resilience, personal or professional development space, will literally switch off. Then there is the quote, "The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results." Now, this is often misattributed to Albert Einstein, but actually it doesn't really matter who said it, because this quote highlights the folly of repeating ineffective actions. It's really straightforward, it's logical, and that's why it cemented its place in the speaking arena. But now, in 2025, it is ridiculously overused. Then there is the mantra, "Fail fast, fail often." This mantra encourages embracing failure as a learning tool on the path to success. It feels like a counterintuitive approach, which has made it really popular, particularly in business and entrepreneurial circles. But what I want you to think about is, how often have you heard this now? How overused is this? Now, there is a reason we want to use stories and metaphors, and there's so many stories about so many people, and there's a reason we want to use them. And this is because they hold the power of the metaphor within them, even when they aren't a metaphor. These stories and these quotes distill complex concepts into easily understandable messages, making them really accessible to a broad audience. And when they first are created, they're powerful. But let's unpack why that happens. The first is that they have emotional resonance. They're evoking emotions and making the messages more impactful and more memorable, and that's why we want to use them. And they are usually reinforcement of universal truths, which is widely accepted beliefs or observations about human behavior and success. And I will talk to my clients and program participants all the time about what we need to do with your story or your topic or the promise or the problem or whatever element it is. We need to ensure that it's appealing to a universality, because it's not until we are appealing to universality that we actually know that your speaking is going to have any form of sustainability or longevity. And that's why we use these. But in this is the danger, because just because they create emotional resonance and just because they're reinforcement of universal truths doesn't make them relevant to your audience or particularly usable. And this is what you risk. When audiences are repeatedly exposed to the same stories or metaphors or quotes or data, it creates a neurological response. Yes, you actually have to understand the brain and how it works to truly master speaking. Now, the impacts are varied, but here's three for you that can take to the bank straight away. And the first is desensitization. The brain may become less responsive to familiar stimulus, leading to reduced emotional engagement because we actually don't respond as well to something that is familiar. And there are so many ways that that plays out in all of our lives. And when that happens, when the brain becomes less responsive to what you were saying, it will dramatically reduce the ability of your audience to remember anything about you because they're switched off. The second is decreased attention. Predictable content can result in lower dopamine releases in the brain. It's a transmitter associated with reward and attention. What this means is that your audience will lose interest. And then there is cognitive fatigue. Repeated exposure to the same narratives can lead to mental fatigue, diminishing the ability to process and retain anything new about it, which means they quite literally switch off again right in front of them. You turn them into a phantom audience. It is true that familiar stories and quotes can provide comfort, and I think that is the premise that most people come with. But overuse leads to diminished impact because the brain seeks novel and stimulating content to maintain engagement. For emerging speakers, using overused stories, metaphors, and quotes comes with significant risks that will undermine your credibility, your differentiation, your overall impact, and an actual point of fact, your ability to launch effectively. Relying on these cliches, these stories, these metaphors, these quotes is a strategic mistake. And I'm going to walk you through right now just some of the ways in which it affects audience perception, your positioning, and even your future opportunities. The first is there's a loss of differentiation and authority. Speakers who blend in get forgotten. When a speaker uses the same tired stories as everyone else, they do not stand out, and the audience will struggle to remember who said what, making it unlikely that you will be booked again or even recommended. The other thing is that your authority is tied to your originality. Emergent speakers need to position themselves as the leaders, not just repeaters of conventional wisdom. Using overdone stories signals a lack of fresh insight, even if your work is deep and rich. The second thing is you end up with reduced audience engagement and trust. There's a cognitive autopilot that kicks in. The human brain, as we said already, is wired to seek novelty. Neuroscience shows us that when people hear something they recognize, their brain processes it faster, and this is at the cost of deeper engagement. And the result? The audience processes faster and then zones out. There's also a loss of trust and credibility in this part. Audiences today are really savvy. If you regurgitate stories that you've heard 100 times before, or that they've heard 100 times before, especially without adding personal insight or original perspective, you may be perceived as lazy, uninformed, or lacking depth. And that leads me straight into the third one, which is the perception of amateurism. Overused content signals straight up, red flag above your head, entry level speaker. Actually, it doesn't just signal it, it screams it. Experienced speakers actually craft narratives that are really unique to them. Relying on generic stories like the starfish story or even the bamboo growth metaphor or things about famous entrepreneurs makes an emerging speaker look like they're still at the beginning stage because they don't have anything unique. You will fail to build personal brand equity if you continue to overuse these stories, metaphors, and data points. Audiences and event organizers everywhere are looking for unique voices. They are not looking for another speaker parroting the same narratives they've heard at every conference. And this is one of the reasons why our annual showcase event, Resonance and Resolve, really stands out, because the content or the perspective from every speaker is novel and our audiences are discovering new voices and fresh content. The fourth of these is that you risk being seen as inauthentic, which I know is the polar opposite of what every single person coming into my world wants. Everybody wants to be perceived as authentic. Borrowed stories also actually lack emotional resonance. The most powerful speaking comes from your lived experience, your worked experience, your unique perspective. And if you lean on someone else's story rather than your own, you are missing the opportunity to create an authentic emotional connection. Now, that comes with a waiver. You have to have balance. It can't be all just your stories. But You have to lean into your own rather than those of others. And audiences can detect scripted inspiration. We can know when you are delivering a story out of obligation or out of cleverness rather than conviction. It diminishes impact and creates a motivational speaker fatigue effect. And that is the last thing that you want. The fifth of these risks is the failure that you have when it comes to creating intellectual property. Speakers who succeed over the long term, they own their ideas. The best paid speakers don't just tell stories, they create stories. They flesh out stories. And from those stories, they create models and frameworks, insights, proprietary information, perspective, guidance. And using an overdone narrative that's not even yours prevents you from being able to develop your own intellectual property. If you don't have legacy, if you don't have your own intellectual property, you will never have scalability. If you build your platform on stories everyone else is telling, you have nothing unique to license, to repurpose, or to expand into books and courses and consulting. It is a dead end street. So then we'll go to the last of these risks. Number 6 is the missed business and speaking opportunities. Event organizers are looking for fresh perspective. Now, it's true that there's not a single new idea, but there are a million fresh perspectives and new ways of looking at things. Many conferences, speaker bureaus, corporate clients actively avoid speakers who rely on the same predictable content. Speakers who repeat the past are less likely to be rebooked. Let me say that again. Speakers who are just repeating the past are less likely to be rebooked. The moment an audience member says, "Oh, I've heard this before," you have lost the opportunity to make a lasting impact, and they will tune out from everything else that you have to say. So that's all well and good. That's the risk. But how do we avoid the risk? Just 3 ways. There are dozens of them, but just 3 for the purpose of this conversation could be to dig into your personal experiences, your failures, and your lessons. It could be to find stories from your industry that haven't been turned into cliches. And it could be working out or working on the skill and ability to create new metaphors and analogies. And my favorite thing to do is take a known story and subvert it. So instead of telling the starfish story, tell it and then challenge it. But here's the flaw in that thinking. Disrupting expectations makes an audience sit up and listen. Look for counterintuitive or less obvious insights. What's the opposite of the cliche that people always hear? So, for example, instead of fail fast, fail often, could you say succeed fast, succeed often, and then back it up? For all of us, overused stories are not just uninspired, they are a high risk liability. The speaking market is so crowded, and differentiation is the only path to long term success. Every speaker, including you, has a choice to be a repeat of what's already out there or bring something original to the stage. The ones who get remembered and rebooked, they choose originality. Now, you need to make surprise and delight your mantra. Now, please understand and listen carefully here. I said surprise and delight, not shock and horrify. Shock and horrify is good for disruption, it's good for launching a cause, but it doesn't give you sustainability and longevity. Just like the story subversion approach above, you can use cliched stories, but you can change your approach. Here are some ways to actually go story hunting really effectively and come up with things that will surprise and delight your audience. I'm going to run through 7 of them with you right now. And if you are driving, continue to listen. But if you're not driving or you're not going for a run, can I suggest that you pull up and get a notebook and take notes? So the first thing is you need to go deeper than the headline stories. Instead of telling the familiar part of a story, uncover lesser known details, hidden struggles, or behind the scenes insights. I'm going to give you examples on each one of these. So instead of the standard Steve Jobs returned to Apple and saved it story, tell how his time at Pixar changed his entire leadership philosophy and how those were the lessons that shaped Apple's second coming. The tactic that you can use to uncover these sorts of stories to read biographies about secondary characters and famous stories. You'll find incredible details that others overlook. So for Steve Jobs' example, and I've said it already, go and read the book about Pixar written by the founder of Pixar that has some extraordinary behind the scenes conversations with the one and only Steve Jobs. The second thing is consider flipping the narrative and challenging the common lessons. So instead of using stories to reinforce conventional wisdom, challenge the expected takeaway. So, for example, instead of saying failure is the stepping stone to success, use James Dyson's story to argue that failure is only useful and James Dyson was the Dyson vacuum cleaners, to argue that failure is only useful when it's structured and intentional. That blind persistence is foolish. So that's an example. But how do you find these? Find the most overused lesson from a story and ask, what's the opposite lesson? And then back it up with data or a fresh perspective or a story that supports it. Okay, so that's number 2. Number 3 is find a different hero or find a different villain. So tell the same story, but shift the focus to an overlooked or unexpected character. Instead of Oprah overcoming adversity, tell how her first producer made a radical choice that transformed her into a national sensation. But how do you do this? Well, the tactical approach to this is research supporting characters in famous success stories. Ask, who is the critical person in this story that nobody's talking about? So that's number 3. Number 4, pull things from unexpected domains. Most of us will pull from business, sports, and history. Go somewhere completely different. As an example, use biological evolution to explain market disruption. Draw insights from mythology, psychology, architecture, or neuroscience to illustrate common business principles. Use a scientific or artistic analogy instead of a business one. But how do you find these? Well, the tactical approach is read outside your industry and actively find ways to connect unrelated ideas. One of the things that just comes to mind now is a story about how jazz musicians actually improvise and how that could be adapted to teaching adaptability in leadership better than another old, tired sports analogy. It really got attention. Recently, we were at an event where the keynote speaker actually talked about her work in leading a massive volunteer army to run huge middle school musical productions, and what she learned from that she applies in her business. It was extraordinary. The entire experience of putting together a musical production for kids of that age became a metaphor for all the lessons and all the things and stages of business. It was extraordinary. The next one, number 5, is use audience participation for an unexpected twist. Now, I will say one thing. If you're an emerging or aspiring speaker, you need to make sure that you've got this one down pat. Because instead of telling a story here, what we're going to do is create an experience where the audience discovers the lesson. And how you do this is tell an incomplete story and then actually ask the audience, so what do you think happened next? How would you solve this problem? Who do you think was responsible for this breakthrough? And then reveal the real outcome. This activates curiosity, creates aha moments. And as I said, you need to be quite masterful to pull it off. But if you can, oh my goodness. So how do we do this? We use prediction pauses in storytelling. Before revealing the outcome, ask the audience to guess. Give 2 versions of a story and let them debate which one they think is true. Either one will work, and either one you need to be sure of your ability to bring the audience back into the story with you. Number 6, and I love this one, is dig into archives and primary sources. Most speakers, most of you, most of us will Google the same articles for research. Many of us don't ever go past page 2, let alone to page 50. You can surprise and delight by going where others don't look. So you can find old interviews, letters, forgotten speeches from famous figures. Dig into historical newspaper archives. They often contain insights that modern retelling misses. Use footnotes from books. These are incredible because they often lead to gold that is not in the main narrative. So if you're doing this online, use Google Scholar, archive.org, and historical newspaper sites. And the other thing is to read out-of-print books on famous figures that relate to your area of expertise or your topic or your solution. And then the last one of these, number 7, is combine 2 stories that shouldn't go together. People expect one story at a time, but what if you intertwine 2 seemingly unrelated stories to create something surprising? So for example, you could compare Beethoven's struggles with creativity to the messy innovation process of SpaceX. You could weave together how Pixar creates emotional moments in films with how top salespeople create emotional connection. What you need to do to reveal these is to ask yourself, what's a completely different field that mirrors the same scenario? And then look for common themes between 2 unrelated stories. You will be amazed how much power this adds to your speaking. No matter what you choose to do with what I've shared with you today, what I know for sure is this. Extraordinary speakers, the ones in demand, from subject matter experts to movement makers to the purely inspirational, have mastered one thing: the art of storytelling, of story shaping, of using story to transport us to somewhere different. They take the ordinary and they create moments that surprise and delight. And when they do that from the stage, they don't just speak. In the words of New Zealand's Can Colquhoun, they bend perception, they challenge assumption. Simply put, they change the way we see the world. Isn't it time that we all did the same?